The air was still that evening, heavy with the scent of dry earth and pine. As the sun melted behind the faraway hills of the frontier, a single rider came through the haze, his horse kicking up dust that shimmered in the golden light. His shadow stretched long across the plain, and though he rode with ease, there was something about him that made the silence around seem sharper. Folks in town said the stranger had eyes like a storm, calm at first glance but dangerous when stirred. He didn't talk much, didn't smile either, and when he did, it was the kind of smile that carried both warning and warmth. The town of Willow Bend wasn't much. A saloon, a general store, a blacksmith, and a church that leaned a little to the left after last winter's storm. Life moved slow there, until that stranger came riding in. He tied his horse outside the saloon, dusted off his hat, and walked inside like he already knew trouble would follow. The piano stopped mid-tune, and every head turned. He didn't care, just ordered coffee, not whiskey, and sat near the window, watching the street like he was waiting for something, or someone. Not far from that same saloon, in a small wooden house with faded paint, a young woman watched from her porch. Her dress was plain, hands still rough from chores, but her eyes carried a quiet kind of beauty that came from courage rather than charm. She'd been living in Willow Bend for barely 6 months, running from something she never spoke about. Folks whispered she was hiding a secret, maybe even a broken heart, but she kept her head down and her story close. That evening, she saw the rider and felt a pull she couldn't name. Something about him looked familiar, not his face, but the way he sat like a man carrying ghosts. The town had seen plenty of drifters, but none like him. And though she told herself not to stare, she couldn't help it. There was danger in him, yes, but there was also safety, the kind that comes from someone who's seen enough of life to understand pain without words. When the sky turned purple and the wind began to cool, the stranger stepped back outside. He looked across the street and his gaze met hers. For a moment, neither moved. The street was quiet, except for the creak of the saloon door and the lazy clink of a horse's bridle. He tipped his hat slightly, and she felt her heartbeat jump. She should have gone inside, but her feet wouldn't listen. Something about his eyes said he knew her story before she could speak it. Later that night, a gunshot echoed through town. Folks ran to the saloon shouting and ducking behind barrels, but by the time they got there, it was over. 2 men lay in the dust, and the stranger stood still, smoke curling from his revolver. No one spoke for a long while. The sheriff came running, breathing hard, and asked what happened. The stranger said in a low voice, "They were following me." "Not anymore." Then he walked out, calm as ever, leaving the whole town wondering who he really was. By morning, his story had already turned into legend. Some said he was an outlaw. Others swore he was a bounty hunter, or maybe a soldier turned bitter by war. But none of them could say for sure. All anyone knew was that trouble seemed to follow him like a shadow. Still, that didn't stop the young woman from thinking about him. She found herself glancing down the road every time a horse passed, hoping and fearing it might be him again. Days later, she found him near the edge of town, fixing his saddle under a cottonwood tree. The air smelled of rain, and thunder rumbled far away. She hesitated before stepping closer, clutching her shawl tight. He looked up, eyes steady, as if he'd been expecting her all along. "You shouldn't be here," he said softly. She swallowed hard and replied, "Maybe not, but I reckon you shouldn't either." For a second, he almost smiled. It wasn't kindness, but something gentler, something human. They talked little, but their silence carried more than words could. She learned his name was Eli, though he didn't offer a last one. He'd been drifting from town to town, chasing something he wouldn't name. She didn't press. They shared a quiet understanding to lost souls pretending they weren't. When a storm rolled in that evening, they found shelter in an old barn near the creek. Rain hit the roof in heavy sheets, and lightning cracked across the open sky. She sat near the haystack, wrapping her arms around herself for warmth. He took off his coat and placed it around her shoulders without a word. The gesture was simple, but spoke louder than a dozen promises. "Why do you keep running?" she asked after a while. His jaw tightened. Sometimes a man runs not because he's scared, but because standing still costs too much. She looked at him, studying the lines on his face, the scar near his temple, the roughness of his hands. There was a heaviness in him, but also a strange peace, like he'd made friends with his pain. Thunder rolled again, shaking the walls, and she startled. Her hand brushed against his chest, not by plan, but instinct. His heart beat strong beneath her touch. For a moment, the air stilled between them. His eyes softened and a faint smile curved at the corner of his lips. "Careful, darlin'," he said quietly, voice low as the rumble outside. "That's where you live now." She froze, not knowing what to say. The warmth of his words sank deep, filling a hollow she didn't realize was still open. He turned away then, tending the fire, as if the moment hadn't changed anything, but it had. Something shifted between them, fragile yet unspoken, like a promise too dangerous to say out loud. When the rain eased, he stood to leave. She wanted to stop him, but fear held her tongue. "Will I see you again?" she asked. He paused at the door, rainwater dripping from his hat. "Depends," he said. "You might not want to." Before she could answer, he stepped out into the fading storm, the sound of his horse fading into the distance. The next morning, the town buzzed with whispers. A group of riders had been spotted on the North Ridge, men dressed in black, asking about a stranger who'd passed through. Folks said they looked mean, like the kind who'd shoot first and bury questions later. The young woman's stomach twisted. She didn't know what Eli had done, but she knew he was in danger. And something inside her couldn't bear to let him face it alone. By sundown, she packed a small satchel, took her father's old revolver, and headed toward the ridge. The wind bit against her face, and dust stung her eyes, but she didn't stop. The sky turned red as fire, and the horizon blurred in the growing dark. Somewhere out there, she knew he was waiting. Maybe not for her, but for the fight he'd been running from too long. As the first stars broke through the twilight, she saw a flicker of campfire in the distance. Her breath caught. She urged her horse forward, every heartbeat echoing louder than the last. She didn't know what she'd find, redemption, danger, or the end of everything, but she knew one thing for certain. When she touched his chest that night, she'd found her place, whether he wanted it or not. And as the firelight drew closer, her fingers tightened around the reins, her heart thundering with a mix of fear and longing, because out there somewhere in the dark, the cowboy who had told her to be careful was about to find out that she wasn't the kind of woman who'd turn away from where she lived now. The wind carried a low hum through the plains that night, stirring the tall grass as the young woman rode toward the faint glow of the campfire. Her heart pounded harder than the horse beneath her. Every sound in the darkness felt sharper, the rustle of leaves, the howl of a distant coyote, the echo of her own thoughts. She didn't know what she would say when she saw him. Maybe nothing at all. He'd just stand there the way she had on her porch that first evening when he'd tipped his hat at her. Something about that small gesture had settled deep inside her, and no amount of reason could shake it loose. As she neared the ridge, the light of the fire flickered stronger. She dismounted, keeping her steps quiet, and crept closer through the brush. The scent of smoke mixed with rain-soaked earth. She saw him then, sitting by the flames with his back to her, cleaning his revolver. His horse grazed nearby, its dark coat shining under the weak moonlight. He looked the same, calm, steady, like a man who'd learned to live in silence. Yet there was something in his shoulders, a weight she hadn't noticed before. She took a breath and stepped into the firelight. He didn't turn right away. Maybe he already knew she was there. "You shouldn't have followed me," he said quietly, his voice carrying the same rough gentleness she'd heard before. "And you told me not to," she replied. "But you also told me that's where I live now." That made him look up. "Oh." A hint of surprise crossing his face before he sighed and set his gun aside. "You've got a stubborn heart," he murmured. "That'll get you hurt one day." She sat across from him, warming her hands near the flames. For a long time neither spoke. The sky stretched wide above them, filled with stars that looked close enough to touch. The quiet between them wasn't awkward, just heavy with things unsaid. Finally she asked, "Who were those men looking for you?" His gaze darkened, flickering with something like regret. "Old friends," he said. "Or maybe enemies. Hard to tell these days." He didn't explain further, but she could tell his story ran deep. The way he scanned the horizon every few moments, the way his hand rested close to his holster, even when he looked relaxed, it all spoke of a man who'd lived too long in danger. He wasn't just a traveler. He was running from something that wouldn't stop chasing him. She wanted to ask more, but the look in his eyes stopped her. Instead, she shifted the question. What did you do before this? Before all the running? He leaned back, glancing toward the fire. I worked with cattle, mostly. Had a small ranch out west. Thought I'd settle down one day, build something that lasted. His tone softened for a second before turning distant. Then came a bad winter. Lost most of the herd. The banks took the rest. After that, the men I worked for got mixed up in things that didn't sit right with me. Guns, debts, blood. I tried walking away, but they don't let a man go easy when he knows too much. She watched him quietly, piecing together his story. So they're after you. He nodded once. Been after me a long time. The fire crackled between them, throwing shifting shadows across his face. What happens when they find you? She asked softly. His eyes met hers, calm and unflinching. Then it ends, one way or another. The weight of his words hung heavy in the air. She wanted to tell him to keep running, to find another town, another life. But she also knew that some men weren't made for hiding. There was something in him that wouldn't bend, something that refused to die quietly. And though she barely knew him, she felt it deep inside her too, that same stubborn fire. As the night wore on, the wind grew colder. He stood to check the horses, and she followed, pulling his coat tighter around her shoulders. You should head back at first light, he said without turning. You don't owe me a thing. She shook her head. I may not. But I don't like leaving folks alone when they've already been left too much. He looked over his shoulder, a faint smile ghosting across his lips. You talk like you know something about that? She did. She'd lost her mother young, her father, a few years later. The man she was supposed to marry never came back from the mines, and when the loneliness got too heavy, she packed her things and came to Willow Bend, hoping to disappear into quiet living. But quiet had never really filled her. Maybe that's why she'd followed him now, because even danger felt more honest than silence. The next day dawned gray and slow. The rain had cleared, leaving the land washed clean and shining under a pale sun. They rode together along the ridge, the air filled with the scent of wet sage. He didn't say much, just kept his eyes on the trail ahead. She studied the way he moved, the quiet confidence in his posture. He seemed born to the saddle, like the land itself had shaped him. By noon, they stopped near a creek to rest the horses. The water ran clear, reflecting the sky. He crouched by the edge, splashing some on his face. You really mean to keep following me? He asked. She smiled faintly. Until I have reason not to, he chuckled, the sound rare and low. You'll get yourself in trouble, maybe, she said, but it'll be my kind of trouble. That afternoon, as they rode farther from town, the land opened wide into empty plains. A hawk circled high above. He suddenly slowed his horse, raising a hand for her to stop. What is it? She whispered. He scanned the horizon, eyes narrowing. Riders, he said. Her pulse quickened. How many? 3, maybe 4. Coming fast. They moved quickly into a thicket, tying the horses behind cover. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder. She crouched low, heart thudding. He drew his revolver, eyes steady, body still as stone. From the shadows they watched the riders pass. Men dressed in dark coats, rifles slung across their saddles. They looked mean, the kind who didn't ask questions before pulling a trigger. When the riders disappeared down the valley, she exhaled shakily. They're close, she said. He nodded, holstering his gun. Too close. They stayed hidden until the dust settled, then rode in the opposite direction. You see now why I didn't want you with me, he said. This isn't your fight. Maybe not, she answered, but it's my choice. He looked at her for a long moment, then gave a slow nod, as if he understood there was no arguing with that kind of resolve. By the time dusk fell, they found shelter in an abandoned cabin near the foothills. The place was old, but sturdy enough. He started a fire, while she unpacked what little food they had, a loaf of bread, some dried meat, a few apples. Long do you think before they find you again? She asked quietly. Hey. Not long, he replied. Men like that don't stop till they finish what they started. The flames flickered across his face, throwing light into the shadow of his jaw. He looked tired, but not weak. Could still turn back, he said again. No one would blame you. She shook her head, voice steady. You forget something? You told me where I live now? Can't expect me to just leave it behind. For the first time, he didn't argue, just stared at her, something unreadable in his eyes, half admiration, half fear. "You're gonna make it real hard for me to keep you safe," he said finally. "Maybe I don't need saving," she answered. Outside, the wind howled through the cracks of the cabin. The horses shifted restlessly. Somewhere far off, a gunshot echoed, faint but clear enough to freeze them both in place. He rose quickly, peering through the window. "They've found the trail," he muttered. Her breath caught. "What do? "We run at dawn," he said. "But if they reach us before that, we fight." He turned back to her then, his expression calm but sharp. "If it comes to that, you do exactly as I say. Promise me." She met his gaze, her own filled with quiet defiance. "I'll try," she said. He gave a small, knowing smile. "That's what I'm afraid of." The fire crackled low, and the night seemed to press closer around them. Every sound outside carried meaning now, the whisper of the wind, the distant cry of an animal, the shifting of the earth beneath their boots. Neither slept much. The air was thick with what was coming, heavy with the kind of silence that comes before a storm. And as the first pale light of morning crept through the cracks, she glanced at him, the stranger who had changed everything with a single sentence. His revolver lay ready by his side, his hat pulled low. He looked peaceful, though she knew peace was the last thing he truly had. In that quiet moment before the world woke, she realized something. She hadn't followed him out of fear or fascination. She'd followed him because he made her feel alive in a way no safety ever had. Though the danger ahead was real and closing fast, she knew one thing for certain: she wouldn't turn back now. Not when her heart had already found its place against the chest of a cowboy who might not live to see another sunrise. The morning air was cold enough to sting, carrying a hush that felt heavy with warning. The sun had barely risen when Eli saddled the horses, his movements quick and practiced. The young woman stood beside him, tying her shawl tighter around her shoulders, trying to ignore the knot of fear tightening in her chest. She could see it in his eyes, the distance, the readiness. He'd lived through mornings like this before, mornings where one wrong move could be the last. "We'll head south," he said quietly, tightening the reins. "There's a canyon past the dry creek, hard to track through there." She nodded, though her mind was already running ahead. "And if they catch up?" He looked at her, his face unreadable. "Then we make sure they regret it." The words sent a chill down her spine. He wasn't boasting, he was remembering. She wanted to ask who those men were to him. What past had turned him into someone who could face death with such calm? But she knew the answer would hurt to hear. Some truths were better revealed by the road itself. They rode in silence through the early light. The land spread wide and empty, dust rising under the hooves. Every so often, Eli would stop to check for tracks, scanning the ridges behind them. His eyes missed nothing. He rode like a man who trusted only what he could see and planned for what he couldn't. She watched him with a strange mix of admiration and worry. Beneath his quiet strength, she sensed an exhaustion that ran deeper than the trail. By noon, they reached the canyon. The rock walls towered high, streaked with red and gold, echoing the call of distant hawks. The air was dry and still. Eli led the horses through a narrow passage where the ground dipped into shadow. "We'll rest here for a bit," he said, glancing over his shoulder. "The sun's too harsh to travel now." They dismounted and found shelter under an overhang. She took a drink from her canteen and looked at him as he scanned the horizon again. "You really think they'll keep chasing you this far?" He didn't answer right away. "They will. I used to ride with them," he said at last. "Years back, when times were rough." Her heart skipped. "You rode with them?" He nodded slowly. "We did things I'm not proud of, we all did. But there came a day when I couldn't stomach it anymore. They wanted more blood. I wanted out. But walking away from men like that leaves a debt unpaid." He turned his gaze toward the canyon wall, jaw tightening. "Their leader Boone, he doesn't forgive. To him, loyalty's a chain, not a choice. And I broke mine." She listened, her stomach twisting. "And they've been hunting you ever since, off and on," he said. "Boone likes to remind me that I can't outrun what I used to be." His tone was flat, but his eyes told a different story, one that carried guilt too heavy for words. She didn't try to comfort him. Instead, she said softly, "Maybe you're not running anymore. Okay, maybe you're just heading toward something better." He looked at her then, studying her face, as though searching for a reason to believe that. "Maybe," he said, his voice quiet. But folks like me don't get clean endings, darlin'. Not in this world. They rested for a while in the cool shade. The sound of water trickling somewhere deeper in the canyon filled the silence. She thought about the life she'd left behind, the faces that no longer mattered. And yet sitting there beside him, she felt more alive than she had in years. It scared her not the danger, but how much she cared for a man whose story was written in scars. As the sun began to dip, they prepared to move again. That was when Eli froze, eyes narrowing at the rim of the canyon. "Riders," he whispered. She followed his gaze and saw faint movement, 3 silhouettes against the sky, dust rising behind them. Her pulse quickened. "They found us. Looks that way." He untied the horses quickly. "We move fast. Stay close." They mounted and urged their horses through the canyon floor, hooves clattering on the rocks. The walls echoed their sound, bouncing it back until she couldn't tell how close the pursuers really were. The path twisted sharply, and for a while they lost sight of the ridge above. Then came the crack of a rifle. The shot rang out, hitting the rock near Eli's leg and shattering it into dust. "Go," he shouted. They raced forward, ducking low, hearts pounding as more shots echoed behind them. The canyon narrowed again, forcing them into a single path. Eli led the way, his horse leaping over a fallen branch as another bullet whistled past. They didn't stop until the trail opened into a small ravine, hidden by brush and stone. Eli dismounted, pulling his horse to cover. "We'll hold here," he said, checking his revolver. She climbed down, hands trembling. "There's only 3 of them," she said, trying to sound steady. "That's still 3 too many," he muttered. He crouched behind a boulder, peering out. The riders were closing in, Boone's men, no doubt. Dust clung to their coats, rifles slung low, eyes hard. They moved with the confidence of men who'd hunted before. The first shot came from Eli's gun, echoing through the ravine. One of the riders fell from his horse. The other 2 fired back, sending rocks flying where she crouched. She pressed herself low, heart hammering. Eli stayed calm, his focus sharp. He fired twice more, forcing the men to scatter behind cover. The gunfire slowed after a few minutes. Silence settled again, thick and tense. Then came a voice, rough and mocking, calling out from the ridge. "Can't hide forever, Eli. Boone says it's time you pay what you owe." Eli's jaw tightened, his hand steady on the revolver. "Tell Boone I already paid plenty," he called back. The man laughed. "Then you won't mind if we collect the rest." Another shot cracked through the air, close enough that she flinched. Eli turned to her quickly. "You need to go, now." She shook her head, eyes fierce. "I'm not leaving you. You don't understand," he said, voice sharp. "If they get you, they'll use you against me." "I can handle myself," she said, lifting the small revolver she'd carried since the night they left Willow Bend. He stared at her, torn between frustration and respect. "You really don't scare easy, do you?" "Not when it comes to you," she replied. Before he could answer, a sudden silence fell again. The riders had vanished from sight. Eli frowned, listening hard. "They're circling," he murmured. "Trying to box us in." He grabbed her hand, leading her through a narrow gap between the rocks. They moved quickly, climbing up the slope. The sound of hooves echoed faintly below. At the top of the ridge they paused to catch their breath. The land stretched far and empty again, but the danger still hung close. "They won't stop," she said softly. "No," he agreed, "they won't. Not until Boone himself is done with me." She looked at him, realizing then that this wasn't just about survival. This was about reckoning with the past, with choices that still bled. He wasn't running from death. He was running from the man he used to be. As night approached, they found shelter in an abandoned line cabin used by trappers long ago. The place smelled of dust and pine. Eli checked the perimeter, then set a small fire. She sat near the door, trying to calm her nerves. "Who is Boone, really?" she asked. Eli's expression hardened. "He's the kind of man who talks soft and kills hard. Started as a ranch foreman. When the railroads came, he turned to robbing them. Said the land belonged to those willing to take it. I was young, angry, and dumb enough to believe him." He looked into the fire, eyes distant. "We thought we were righting wrongs. But it was never about justice. It was greed, dressed up as pride. She listened, her heart aching at the quiet guilt in his voice. And now he wants revenge. Eli nodded. He lost a brother the day I walked away. He blames me for it. Maybe he's right. Outside, the wind whistled through the cracks. Every flicker of light felt fragile, every shadow too long. You ever think about going back? She asked, facing him, his jaw clenched. Every day, but not like this. Not until I know I've got something worth standing for again. She looked at him, realizing he already did, even if he didn't see it yet. He had her, and though she couldn't promise him safety, she could promise he wouldn't have to fight alone. They stayed quiet after that, each lost in their own thoughts. But somewhere in the stillness, they both felt it. The storm that was coming, the reckoning neither could avoid. Far out in the dark, a wolf howled. And somewhere beyond the hills, Boone and his men rode closer, drawn by vengeance, by the scent of unfinished business. The fire flickered low, casting shadows on the cabin walls. She reached for Eli's hand without a word, and he didn't pull away. Both of them knew that when the next dawn came, it would bring more than sunlight. It would bring blood, truth, and choices that couldn't be undone. And as the night deepened, they sat side by side, listening to the quiet before everything changed. The night stretched long, heavy with the kind of silence that carried warning. The fire inside the cabin had burned low, leaving only the soft orange glow that flickered against the rough wooden walls. Eli sat near the door, revolver laid across his knee, eyes never leaving the darkness outside. The young woman stayed close to the dying fire, her hands wrapped around her shawl, trying to keep her breathing steady. Every crack of the wood, every sigh of wind through the gaps in the boards felt like the sound of danger drawing nearer. He hadn't spoken much since sunset. His focus had narrowed, every muscle in his body coiled and ready. She wanted to say something, anything, to break the silence, but words felt small against the weight of what was coming. He finally spoke without turning his head. They'll come at dawn. Boone always liked the light for killing, said it made men easier to look in the eye. The calmness in his tone unsettled her more than fear would have. Then we have till morning, she said softly. He nodded once. It's not long enough. She looked at him, studying the way the firelight caught the scar along his cheek, the faint tremor in his jaw when he thought no one noticed. He wasn't scared, not in the way most men would be. He'd just accepted the fight ahead, as if this was always how his story was meant to end. That scared her more than Boone ever could. Eli, she said quietly, what if we just kept riding? Didn't stop till we crossed the desert. You could start over again somewhere. He shook his head. Boone's not the kind to quit. He'd hunt us till the world ran out of places to hide. Can't let him keep coming. She stood then, walking to the window where the moonlight spilled through the cracks. You talk like it's already over, she said. Doesn't have to be. He looked up at her, eyes tired but steady. You don't understand. Boone and I, we started this together. We made a mess that stretched further than we ever meant it to. I walked away, but he didn't. He made it worse, and now every wrong thing we ever did has a trail that leads back to me. Maybe this ends when one of us is gone. Her throat tightened. She wanted to shout that he didn't owe anyone his death, but she knew it wouldn't change what he felt. His code ran deep, the kind of honor that came with a cost. Outside, the wind picked up, howling low through the canyon. She stepped closer to him. Then, if this is where it ends, I'm not letting you face it alone. He met her gaze, and for a moment the steel in his eyes softened. You should have never come into my story, he said. You deserved peace, not this. She smiled faintly. Peace never found me, Eli. Maybe this was where I was supposed to be all along. The words settled between them like a vow neither of them dared to break. When dawn finally began to rise, it came slow and red, painting the world in light that felt almost cruel. Eli stood, checked his gun, and glanced toward the window. They're coming, he said. His voice was quiet, but his eyes were sharp. She moved beside him, peering through the cracks in the boards. Dust rose on the far side of the plain. Riders. 4 of them, dark shapes cutting through the light. Boone was among them. Eli stepped outside first, his boots crunching on the dry earth. The air was cold and still, waiting. She followed, though every part of her body screamed to stay hidden. He turned to her, his tone low but firm. When I tell you to ride, you don't look back. I'm not leaving. she whispered. Darlin', you have to, he said, his jaw tightening. This ain't your fight. Maybe it is, she said, voice trembling. You said once that's where I live now. You can't expect me to run from it. He looked at her for a long moment, then gave a small nod. You're something else. You know that. The riders grew closer, their shapes clearer now. Boone led them, a tall man with a long coat and a face carved hard by years of cruelty. Even from a distance, his grin carried the arrogance of someone who believed he already owned the outcome. Eli stood tall, hat pulled low, hand resting lightly on his holster. The young woman could feel the tension building in the air like thunder before a storm. Every breath felt heavy. Every heartbeat was louder than the wind. Boone and his men stopped a few yards away. Sound of horses snorting filled the silence. Boone dismounted slowly, dust swirling around his boots, while he said, voice carrying easily across the distance, I'll be damned. Didn't think you'd have the nerve to stand still this time. Eli's expression didn't change. You found me. You got what you came for. Let the others go. Boone's grin widened. Others? You mean her? His eyes flicked toward the woman. She's the reason you stayed put, ain't she? Didn't take you for the sentimental kind. Eli's fingers twitched near his gun. Leave her out of it, Boone chuckled. Now that don't sound like the man I used to ride with. You've gone soft, friend. Guess that means I'm doing you a favor putting you down. The air went still. For a moment no one moved. Then Boone's hand dropped toward his holster and everything happened fast. Gunfire split the air, echoing through the canyon walls. Eli's revolver flashed, sending Boone's first man tumbling from his saddle. She ducked behind a barrel, her heart pounding as bullets tore through the wooden walls of the cabin. Eli moved quick, smooth, firing with precision born from years of survival. He dropped another man, then dove behind cover as Boone's last fired back. The young woman gripped her small revolver, her hands trembling. She could barely see through the smoke, but she caught sight of Boone moving toward the cabin. Eli turned, firing once more, forcing Boone back. Stay down, Eli shouted, reloading as fast as he could. I can help, she cried. Not this time, he yelled back. She ignored him. Crawling toward the window, she aimed through the crack and fired. The shot missed Boone but struck the ground near his feet, making him curse and retreat. Her pulse raced with fear and adrenaline. Eli looked at her, shaking his head slightly, but with the ghost of a smile. You really don't listen, do you? The sound of hooves echoed again. The last of Boone's men circled wide, trying to flank them. Eli saw it coming and pushed her toward cover. Stay here, he ordered, then darted out from behind the cabin, rolling behind a wagon and firing twice more. The return fire hit close. Splinters flew from the wagon. One bullet grazed his arm, tearing through his sleeve. He hissed in pain but didn't stop, as the young woman pressed her hand to her mouth to keep from crying out. Then, through the smoke and chaos, Boone's voice rose again. Think you can kill me, Eli? You've already tried once? Eli froze for a second, eyes narrowing. The words hung in the air, heavier than the gunfire. She turned toward him, confusion crossing her face. Boone laughed. Didn't tell her that part, did you? You shot me in the back when you ran? Left me bleeding in the dirt while you rode off with half the gold? Eli's face hardened. You were going to kill a family, Boone. That gold wasn't worth their lives. Boone's grin twisted into a sneer. You don't get to play righteous now. He lifted his rifle, aiming steady. You die with the lies you made. Eli moved before Boone could fire, rolling and shooting in one motion. The shot grazed Boone's shoulder, spinning him back. But one of Boone's men took the chance to fire, and Eli stumbled, falling to one knee. She screamed his name, running from her cover before he could stop her. She grabbed his arm, pulling him behind the wagon as bullets tore through the air. His breathing was rough, and she saw blood spreading across his side. Eli, stay with me, she whispered, pressing her hand against the wound. His jaw clenched, eyes fierce even through the pain. You have to run. Go now. I'm not leaving, she said, her voice breaking. Boone's boots crunched closer, the sound slow and deliberate. You can't hide forever, he called. You'll both die in there. Eli looked at her, the fire in his eyes dimming into something softer. If he gets close, you aim for his chest, he said quietly. Don't think. Just do it. Tears stung her eyes. He put his hand over hers, the same place she'd touched before, right over his heart. Careful, darlin', it's still where you live. Before she could speak, he pushed himself up, revolver in hand, stepping into the open. The light of dawn hit his face as he raised his gun toward Boone, blood soaking through his shirt. The young woman watched, frozen, her heart racing. Ow! The world seemed to hold its breath. Boone's finger tightened on the trigger. Eli stood tall, and the distance between them felt like the edge of fate. The final standoff had begun. The air between them hung thick with dust and silence. The rising sun painted the sky a pale gold, spilling across the barren ground where two men faced each other one last time. Boone's eyes burned with fury, but there was something else beneath it too, a flicker of recognition, of memory. Eli's breath came hard, his revolver steady, even though blood ran down his side. The world seemed to shrink to that single space between them, where the past and present finally collided. Boone took a slow step forward, his hand tightening on the trigger. "You always were faster," he said, voice rough. "But this time, you're bleeding, and I've got more to lose." Eli's eyes never left him. "You already lost it when you started killing for gold." Boone's face twisted. "You left me to die." Eli's voice was quiet but sure. "You were already dead inside." The sound of 2 gunshots cracked through the still morning. The echo rolled through the canyon, chasing away the silence that had hung over them for too long. When it faded, Boone was on his knees, his rifle slipping from his hand. Eli stood still for a moment, then lowered his gun. Boone's eyes lifted, full of pain and disbelief. "Guess you were still faster," he rasped. Eli walked toward him, steady but slow, each step heavy with years of regret. He knelt beside Boone, the sun catching the blood on the ground. "Didn't have to end like this," Eli said softly. Boone tried to speak but couldn't. His breath left him like the wind dying in the canyon, and then he was gone. For a moment, Eli didn't move. He looked at the man who'd once been his brother in arms, the one who'd shared long nights and hard rides, and felt a deep ache that went beyond words. The fight was over, but the victory felt hollow. Behind him, the young woman called his name, her voice trembling. He turned just as his strength gave out. She ran to him, catching him before he fell completely. His hand pressed weakly against her shoulder, trying to steady himself. "It's done," he whispered. She nodded, tears streaking her face. "You did what you had to." He gave a small, tired smile. "That's what I kept telling myself all these years." She helped him sit down beside the wagon. The wind had settled, and for the first time in days, the desert felt still again. She tore a strip from her shawl and pressed it against his wound. He winced, but didn't stop her. "You're going to be all right," she said, even though she wasn't sure if she believed it. He looked at her, his gaze steady but fading. "You've got a kind heart," he murmured. "The world's cruel, but don't let it harden you like it did me." "Don't talk like that," she whispered. "We can still ride. There's a doctor in the next town. He'll make it." He didn't answer right away. His eyes wandered toward the open land stretching far into the horizon. "Ever notice," he said slowly, "how quiet it gets after a storm?" She followed his gaze. The wind was soft now, brushing against the dry grass, carrying the faint scent of dust and sunlight. He gave a faint smile. "It's the world's way of saying it still goes on, no matter who's left standing." She squeezed his hand tighter. "You're still standing, Eli." He looked at her then, and for the first time since she'd met him, his eyes were at peace. Maybe for a little while longer. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the canyon. By the time she looked down again, his breathing had slowed. He closed his eyes, a faint trace of that tired smile still on his face. She stayed beside him, her hand resting over his heart until she felt it grow still. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was calm, as if the earth itself understood something sacred had passed. Later, when the day had fully risen, she built a small grave beneath the lone mesquite tree near the cabin. She marked it with a rough wooden cross and his hat resting on top. The land stretched wide and endless around her, a place where stories like his often ended and others began. Before she left, she looked back one last time. "You were right," she whispered. "The world keeps going." She saddled the horse he'd left her and rode out across the open plain. The road ahead was uncertain, but she carried something with her now, not just the memory of him, but the courage he'd given her. She had seen what true strength looked like, not in the fight itself, but in the choice to stand when everything said to run. As she rode, she passed through small towns and quiet valleys. places where his name had once carried fear or legend. She never spoke of what happened that morning, but the story traveled anyway. People said the outlaw Boone was gone, that a man named Eli faced him under the desert sun and ended the blood between them. Some said he died there, others that he vanished into the mountains to live out his days in peace. She never corrected them. Some stories belonged to the wind. Months later, she reached a town by the river where no one knew her name. She found work at a small inn, helping travelers who came and went with stories of their own. Every evening, when the light faded and the world grew quiet, she'd sit outside, watching the sunset paint the water gold. Sometimes she'd think she saw a rider far out in the distance, a figure crossing the horizon just as the light broke. And in that moment, she'd smile, not because she believed it was him, but because it reminded her that he was still part of the land somehow. Time moved gently after that. The pain of what happened softened, replaced by something steadier, understanding. She learned that even in loss there could be peace, and that courage wasn't always about fighting. Sometimes it was about letting go and choosing to live when the past tried to pull you under. Years later, when travelers came through the inn and asked about the grave under the mesquite tree, she would tell them that it belonged to a man who once lost himself, but found his soul again before the end. She'd tell them he wasn't a hero, not in the way stories like to say, but a man who tried to make things right, even when it was too late for himself. And when they asked about her, she'd smile softly and say, "Just someone who was there to see it happen." The land never forgot him. Seasons changed, the rains came and went, and wildflowers grew around the grave every spring. The wind carried his name across the canyons, and sometimes at dusk, when the world turned gold, it almost sounded like a whisper, gentle, fleeting, alive. For her, life became quieter, but fuller. She learned to find beauty in simple things, the way the river caught the morning light, the laughter of children running past the inn, the kindness of strangers who stopped to rest. She no longer feared the silence. It had become her friend, her reminder that peace wasn't something you found out there in the wild. It was something you carried once you stopped running from yourself. As the years passed, she visited that grave once more. The wooden cross had weathered, and the hat was long gone, but the tree had grown tall and strong. She stood there for a long time, the wind tugging gently at her dress. "You were right," she said softly. "The world kept going. I did too." When she turned to leave, the horizon was painted with the same light that had once broken over the canyon the morning he fell. It reminded her that endings weren't really endings, just turns in a story that kept on living in every breath, every heart brave enough to remember. The desert stretched behind her, endless and golden, carrying the quiet memory of two souls who met in the storm and found a kind of peace in its wake. Somewhere out there, the wind still whispered his name, and she smiled, knowing that some stories never truly die, they just ride on forever.